right, well, good afternoon, and my name is Levi Tinker. I'm here today with uh, probably the definitive uh, expert and historian on the Wizard of Oz,
I'll tell him when he comes in.
and the author of the the Wonderful World of Oz, an illustrated
Yes.
history of an American classic. I'm pleased to have here with us today John Fricke.
Thank you very much. Not only did you get the credits right, you pronounced the name right. I have had it as Frickle and Frisbee and Frike and Fritchie, so it's nice to hear it correctly. The remaining Frickies in Wisconsin will be very happy, I'm sure.
Nice. Cool. Well, thank you for joining us here today. And of course, last time I saw you was when we actually had the big gala reopening of
Yes.
the theater as an IMAX theater with the TCL Chinese Theater, and with that gala world premiere of the IMAX 3D restoration of The Wizard of Oz.
That was so extraordinary. I had been doing Oz projects well, I've been doing them for over 35 years now. But to go to the Chinese theater where the film launched, as people can see with your screen there to the side, uh, and to be asked to MC an event of that caliber, I mean, this has been part of my day-to-day life since I was 5 years old. And given your enthusiasms, whatever they may be, you know that we don't choose these things, they choose us. Well, I never expected across any of those intervening years to be at the Chinese theater in any capacity but sitting there and laughing and crying. And I did get to do that, but first we got to talk and introduce people, and we had Ruth Ducini, who
Hmm.
was one of two surviving Munchkins from the film, of Little People Munchkins. There are some of the Munch kids who are still with us, the little girls from a dancing school who participated at ages 9 and 10, but they're full-grown adults now. And then a couple days later at the Chinese Theater, we had Jerry Marin, the Lollipop Guild guy, in the middle, put his handprints and footprints in. Now, you guys made an extraordinary event of that, and no less extraordinary or no more extraordinary than The Wizard of Oz deserves.
I know for me, I even to have helped place Jerry's hands in the cement during that was such a special honor. And then a couple days later, when it opened for the regular engagement for the public, and he came out and surprised the audience with that Sunday afternoon matinee attending it, and just when the audience realized that they were experiencing The Wizard of Oz on the big screen in the theater where it premiered in Hollywood with Jerry, with the Lollipop Kid, it the audience in there loved it.
Well, the same with Ruth. The same. I know part of my job on the festival afternoon was that to talk about the Munch kids who were in the audience and the relatives of the participants in the film, in front of or behind the camera. And there's just something about, if you're a fan, and it's very difficult to find anybody who doesn't know that film probably better than any other, not because they've studied it, but just by dint of repetition. And so all of that ends up meaning something to people, because you and I are well, you're much younger than I am, but you are of a generation where it was on TV, or if it wasn't on TV once a year, you had access to home video. And there are now 4 and 5-year-olds who have seen that film more times than I have in 64 years, because they can look at it on demand, on request, and it it doesn't lose, which is the amazing thing. You think back to the golden age of Hollywood and how many classic films and classic stars there were, but they are to a greater extent forgotten or unknown by anybody under the age of 40 or 45. And thanks to what MGM was able to do, and that only MGM could do back then, or would do, uh, we have Oz and all of those people forever. And I'm very grateful to be tangential to it all. I truly am.
When did you first realize this was going to have an impact on your life, going into becoming an adult and ultimately your career?
Well, on my life, that very first time it was on television, November 3rd, 1956, I was 5,
Hmm.
and I didn't know the film. I had a record player, and that ages me right there. I had a record player and lots of children's records, Disney records, Warner Brothers records, Mary Martin as Peter Pan, that sort of thing. But Oz, for some reason, hit me the way nothing else had. And I talked of nothing else for days after. Now, I am prone to enthusiasm, but my parents recognized this. And for my next birthday, they bought me the Wizard of Oz soundtrack album, a Wizard of Oz abridgment storybook. And they gave me an album that Judy Garland had recorded in 1956 as a woman of 34. So I would alternate the two records. I was an early reader, so I breezed through that picture book hundreds of times. When I found out that it was called an abridgment, I had to find out what abridgment meant. And when I found out there was a longer version, I didn't rest until I got the whole story. Then a year and a half later, I found out there were 40 Oz books, or 39 Oz books at that point altogether, and that Judy had made other movies and other records. And I had the most, what's a good enough word? It's not indulgent, the most supportive, and caring parents. They supplied all this stuff. They were set for birthdays and Christmases and Easter, and because they felt quite correctly what harm can come to anybody from the Oz books or MGM musicals or the great popular songbook. So this was all in the works before I even hit first grade. And it snowballed after that. In the 60s, I found out that there was an International Wizard of Oz club, mostly for book people. I found out that there was a Judy Garland club. She made her huge comeback in 61 and was the biggest star in the world for that first part of that decade. I got to see her in concert several times in Chicago from Milwaukee. And by the time I got to college, I went to Northwestern in journalism. There were other people who were interested in show business who had done their high school shows, and it just fed on itself. And when I moved to New York in 1974, there was an even greater contingent of people who understood that and got it and wanted to share it and talk about it. Then all of a sudden, along the way, I had met people who had worked with Judy. I worked for her third husband, Sid Luft, for a while. He put me in touch with people who were doing a PBS documentary about her in 1985, and that led to the 50th anniversary book, the 50th anniversary videotape, the documentaries, the CDs, the DVDs, everything since then. It was never supposed to be a career. Never. That was never my, who thought you could have a career doing this? But I said at one point, right after Judy died and everybody was reflecting on how she had impacted on their lives, I wrote to someone, I said, I feel so fortunate to have been chosen to be a Judy Garland fan, because it opens the world to all of those entertainers, all of those songwriters, all of the directors and the technicians and musicians, and then Oz, no matter what they do to it, no matter how much they do revisions of The Wiz or what they do with Wicked and Oz the Great and Powerful, all of which I like, don't get me wrong, but it all always comes back to MGM, 1939. Timeless doesn't even begin to say it, nor does iconic. We've got to find a new adjective.
What is, and tying back into the beginnings of the movie, how when you were doing your research and what you found out, what was it that led to MGM acquiring the rights and deciding that they wanted to do this as a big movie at that time?
Well, they had Judy under contract from October of 1935, and she hung around the studio doing nothing for over a year because they didn't know how to market a 13-year-old girl who sang like a 30-year-old woman. They knew she was extraordinary, but they finally started putting her in bit parts. They did a loan out to Fox for one picture. And then when she was invited to sing at Clark Gable's birthday party, and Roger Eden's, the unsung hero of MGM musicals in terms of arrangement and coaching and all associate producing, he wrote Dear Mr. Gable for her, which was such a smash at the party, and at a benefit later that same night at the Trocadero, I think it was, boom, they put it into Broadway Melody of 1938, in which she was going to appear anyway. All of a sudden, she had a public identity. She was a teenager. And as she said, until Mickey Rooney and Deanna Durbin and she came along, Hollywood didn't know from teenagers. She once, on the Jack Parr show, she once said, you know, they weren't interested in 12-year-old girls, 13-year-old girls. She said you either had to be a munchkin, meaning like Shirley Temple. She said, or you had to be 18, pantomiming a well-endowed young Corinne. And she and Mickey and Deanna were none of those things. But the audience was becoming engorged with teenagers, and they were thrilled to see other teenage performers. So I got off track. I apologize. MGM, when the Gable song was a hit and Judy was a hit, Arthur Freed, who wrote the other songs in Broadway Melody and who had been at Metro writing great lyrics, Singing in the Rain, You Were Meant for Me, You Were My Lucky Star, for a decade practically, he wanted to produce films. And Mayer said, find a property. And Freed said, I want to work with Judy Garland. Freed knew he wasn't going to get Jeanette MacDonald or Eleanor Powell for his first producing vehicle. He had to go with somebody from the slightly lower strata. And Arthur found the Wizard of Oz property. At the same time, Mervyn LeRoy came over to MGM as a producer from Warner Brothers, and he had always wanted to do a film of the Wizard of Oz. At that point, there had been virtually an Oz book a year for over 30 years, the continuing series. Oz was a huge commercial marketplace, and the first story especially. So this is how it all coalesced. Then what really kicked it into gear is that in December of 37, Walt Disney premiered a musical fantasy cartoon movie, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And all of a sudden there was a market for musical fantasy. And Metro decided, and as I said many times, Metro is the only studio that would have invested the money and the time in doing something like Wizard of Oz. The money people here in New York, Nick Skank at Lowe's Incorporated, tried to shut the film down at least 3 times. Before it ever got started, after the first 2 weeks of filming, when they fired the director and Buddy Ebsen became ill and they had to replace the Tin Man, and then again a few weeks after that, because the budget went from like 1.2 million, which was enormous, to 1.8 to 2.2. By this time it was done, MGM, between the production costs and prints and advertising, spent $3.7 million on The Wizard of Oz. And in those days, you could have made 4 big pictures and probably about 20 Andy Hardys and Dr. Kildares and Maisies for that amount of money. But it was the showcase for Judy, and you realize that they really must have believed in her, because she had done the 6 B-level musicals, and she had a hit record, and she'd been on the radio, and everybody loved her. But to build a musical of that stature and that cost around a 16-year-old, and as much as I loved the film, it wasn't until a few years ago that I put it into perspective of that girl, except for the scenes of Miss Gulch on her bike, and the trio going to the witch's castle to rescue her. She is in virtually every frame of that movie. And that is saying something for, but they knew she could do it. And I think it was the coalescence of the time had come for Oz, the time had come for a new kind of musical. You had Roger Edens and Arthur Freed launching what they were going to be for the next 25, 30 years, although none of them knew it at the time. Again, fate, karma, kismet, God, we were very fortunate that it turned out as well as it did. If you know the backstories of the strange scripts and the extraneous characters, it is a miracle that the film turned out as well as it did.
Yeah, and one of the things that is incredible about it, besides the amazing cast, is the special effects at the time as well too that you have are just incredible, and the makeup.
Well, when I go out and talk about the film, one of the points I make, especially to younger people, not necessarily kids who aren't maybe film conversant yet, but certainly to teens and anybody older, is that there was no such thing as CGI in 1938, 39. Everything they were seeing on that screen had to be either literally or figuratively made out of whole cloth. In the case of the tornado, it was whole cloth. It was muslin, wrapped around all that chicken wire. Again, I think of the tornado because, again, one of the things that struck me that first time of seeing Oz, if I hadn't gone into what I went into, I might have become a meteorologist, because the tornado absolutely dazzled me. And since then, I found out that when they made the tornado for The Wizard of Oz, there were photographs of tornadoes, but there was only one 28-second grainy, scratchy, black and white film of a waterspout off Cuba or Puerto Rico or something like that to go on. So they really were flying blind. They couldn't, you know, go to the Weather Channel and say, send us every bit of footage you've got and we'll adapt it. Uh, the tornado, the gathering the little people, as they like to be called, to play the Munchkins from all over the country. Um, you know, a flying witch, a melting witch, all those sets.
Yeah.
You know, and you think, okay, yes, a lot of that is painted backdrop or matte paintings. You know, the Emerald City from afar is a crayon drawing about that big,
Mm-hmm.
and great. But you know, Munchkinland had to be built. The interior of the Emerald City had to be built. The haunted forest and the lion forest and the farm,
Yeah.
and of course that was what MGM did.
Mm-hmm.
Those 4,000 or 5,000 people they had under employ were there to work at times in 24 hours, you know, 3 shifts
Yeah.
all day, so that for 24 hours something was being created on that lot. There's a great quote from one of the MGM technicians who said, many people worked for many studios and they made good movies. We worked for MGM, we made better ones. And I think certainly in the case of The Wizard of Oz and so much else that is true.
Yeah. Now, of course, when a lot of people think of the Chinese theater, one of the main movies that they think of is The Wizard of Oz, and you know, beyond the Hollywood premiere and in the showings that we've had over the years of it, there is another connection that I've heard over the years as well too, about in particular with the creation of the song "Somewhere Over the Rainbow." There's a loose kind of thread connecting it with Harold Arlen heading to see a movie at the Chinese theater, inspiration striking him, and having his wife pull over, and the inspiration right there for what became Somewhere Over the Rainbow.
Well, that is what I've always heard. You know, Arlen says that himself. They had written what they called the Lemon Drop songs for Wizard of Oz. He and Yip Harburg, If I Only Had a Brain, Munchkinland, Mario Land of Oz, Ding Dong the Witch is Dead. All of that was done. But what is now called in Broadway parlance the I Want song, the song that the protagonist sings 12 minutes into the show that tells you what they're going to be looking for the next 2 hours. And Arthur Freed had sent a very impassioned memo to the script writers, even before Yip and Harold signed on, about 2 weeks before. But it talked at length about Dorothy's longing and how they really had to have do that in a song.
Yeah.
And Harold was very nervous about it because he couldn't come up with anything. And his wife, Anya, suggested, let's go to a movie. And so they got in the car and he said, you drive, I'm too nervous. And he said, Mrs. Arlen was driving, and they got to Schwab's drugstore up the road. And he said, Annie, pull over. And she knew enough to pull over. And he always carried a little pad of paper, a little like notebook with him, and a pencil. And there on the boulevard, he wrote, da 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 da. He finally had something to work with. And he was so relieved, and then he went home and finished it. The irony, of course, is that when Yip Harburg came over to hear this great number that Arlen was so happy to play, Arlen played it in a crashing, grandiose, symphonic style, and he finished, and Harburg looked at him and said, that's for Nelson Eddy, that's not for a little girl in Kansas. And Harold was just crushed. But they called over Ira Gershwin, who was a neighbor and a dear, dear friend. And Harold played it again with a little bit less bravura. And Ira purportedly said to him, now, play it a little bit more like a pop song, a little bit lighter, a little bit more, not rhythm, but just a gentle kind of beat. And Harburg, hearing it that way, said, well, that I can work with that. And Harold had written the basic 32 bars of the song, and it was Ira Gershwin's suggestion that they add the tag at the end, the little, if happy little bluebirds fly, to the end of the song. So Ira Gershwin was kind of like the midwife on that song. But it did all start on the boulevard with Harold and his notepad.
Oh, nice. I think one of the things I remember from when we had that the 75th anniversary celebration and with the launch of the IMAX 3D conversion was what you know, Wizard of Oz, of course, was shot in three strip Technicolor, but there were some people who didn't necessarily want that to be the case, if I remember correctly. Was there someone at MGM that was not a fan of Wizard of Oz being filmed in using three strip Technicolor?
I think if anybody associated with Metro didn't want Oz in color, it would have been Nick Skank back at Lowe's in New York, because that added so much to the cost. One reason so many of Judy didn't do another major Technicolor film after The Wizard of Oz until Meet Me in St. Louis. She had a guest song in Thousands Cheer in 1943 in color, but the whole scope from 39 to 44 was all black and white, because she was such a box office star. As somebody said, all you have to do is put her name on the marquee and people will come in. You don't need Technicolor. But for Oz, they did, because again, that was part of the charm. I don't know if they were aware of this at the time, but when Frank Baum wrote the Wizard of Oz book, and of course, chapter 1 is the cyclone in the book. There are no farmhands, there's no Miss Gulch, there's no Professor Marvel. Dorothy is a little girl, younger than Judy was, and the tornado picks up the house and carries her away. But in that chapter, Baum had spent time in the late 1880s and into the early 1890s in Dakota Territory, trying for a career there, a couple different careers there. And it was at the time of a drought, and the sun had burned everything gray. Now, Baum sets Wizard of Oz in Kansas, maybe not to offend his South Dakota relatives a decade later, but in that first chapter of the Oz book, he uses the word gray 9 times to describe Aunt Em, Uncle Henry, the grass, the sky, everything. And Yip Harburg said that that was one reason he came up with the idea of a rainbow, as that would be the only thing that little girl ever saw that was really colorful. But the whole idea of doing Oz, Kansas to Munchkinland, black and white or sepia, it was filmed in black and white and then washed in that amber brown, glowy kind of colorization. That was part of it from the beginning, and it may have been something that Skank said, no, you can't do this film, but if you're going to do it, you can't do it in color. You know, I'm sure there was a lot of back and forth, because they started negotiating for Oz in late 1937, and they didn't sign the contracts with Goldwyn, who owned the property, until the following June. It was announced before that, because Goldwyn was going to sign them to it, but they had to deal with the Baum estate and the Denslow estate, William Wallace Denslow, who did the pictures for the first book. It was a very complicated process. And as it went on across all those months, writers came and went. There were ultimately 14 different consultants or writers on The Wizard of Oz, 3 of whom got credit, 5 directors, 3 choreographers, you know, who came and went. MGM had not done anything of that scope since Mutiny on the Bounty. Now, Mutiny on the Bounty was a proven property, and they had Clark Gable. So, you know, that was not as much, to spend $1 million plus on Mutiny on the Bounty was not that big a gamble. To spend it on a Technicolor musical fantasy with no star's name above the title and nobody below the title starring. If you look at the credits, it's The Wizard of Oz with, and then the list of everybody. It was a gamble, but it certainly paid off.
And then that Technicolor paid off for years later when they did begin work on that 3D conversion. And that's a big, because it's one of the most beautiful 3D conversions that's ever been done, and a lot of it has to do with that, correct?
Oh, absolutely, because MGM, Turner, Warner Brothers, however you follow the ownership arc, they have taken extremely good care of Oz, especially since the 1980s, when they kind of realized, ooh, this one isn't going to go away, you know? And finally going back, I forget when it was, to the original 3-strip Technicolor negatives, which exist by the grace of God, and cleaning them up frame by frame, and then laying them down, each frame of the 3 strips on top of each other, and getting the registration perfect. And then beyond that, a few years later, the IMAX and the 3D effect. And you had the purists, or I want to see it in 3D, or what are they doing? And it turned out to be rapturous, because they did just enough with 3D to enhance it and to make it even more of a theatrical experience than it could be. I know I didn't see Wizard of Oz on the screen until I was 20 years old. I didn't see it in color till I was 20 years old. We didn't have a color set at home. So even in the kind of blurred, by comparison, prints they had, I was dazzled. But to see it now, I know Rob Hummel, who oversaw some of this technical work in the early 2000s, and I were sent to the Deauville Film Festival in 2005 to launch the refurbished Wizard of Oz. And he and I went to the theater to do a test screening of the first couple of reels just to make sure everything was copacetic. And I stood next to him, and there were so many moments even before 3D where the restored and refurbished print, realigned print, looked three-dimensional. And the 3D only enhanced it. There are moments when I think always it strikes me when Dorothy is singing and dancing toward the camera and the Munchkins are coming behind her and they're singing You're Off to See the Wizard. You feel like you were standing next to the camera and that they're all coming towards you. And I think if there were any film people could go back in a time machine and visit the set to see, Wizard of Oz would be one of the prime exponents of this. And now, thanks to what IMAX and 3D have done, this is entirely possible.
It's very cool. I remember my first time seeing it on the big screen was back in '98. I was working at a theater as a projectionist in Florida. And so I got to build the print up and then screen it. And it was the first time I saw it on the big screen. It was just amazing. And then I remember a few years later after I had moved out here, and it was when the Munchkins got their star on the Walk of Fame in front of our gift shop. We had that screening that night with Johnny Grant in attendance and everything. And seeing it on our screen on a beautiful 35 millimeter show print inside the original Chinese theater took and just blew away the experience of seeing the print that we built up back in Florida, because it was pillar box, whereas here we had it presented with the masking and just looked absolutely beautiful. So it's amazing how well of a job they've done preserving and everything over the years.
Well, and the fact that no matter what they do to it, it gets better and better in terms of clarity and color and brightness and sharpness. And even that, even seeing, okay, now there you can kind of see Judy's freckles under the makeup, or she had a pimple that day, or you can see the wig line on Bert Lahr. The enchantment, for lack of a less esoteric word, never quits. You never step out of the film. You do for a minute say, oh my gosh, there's the muslin tornado. Oh, there's where Margaret Hamilton went into the Munchkinland floor, and we're seeing the good take, not the take where she got burned. That was the second take. And all of that comes to the fore. But I, to be honest with you, and I don't mean to jar, again, purists or film fans, but when I see it now on a 35 millimeter print, it doesn't have the clarity or the impact. Same thing with The Star is Born, which they redid beautifully at Warner Brothers a few years ago. And I saw it at a theater here during a Judy Garland Film Festival about 9 years ago. And it was like I'd never seen the film before. To see it in that 2K, 4K, 6K, whatever it is. I'm no techno, obviously. But I couldn't believe the stereophonic sound and Cukier's use of CinemaScope. Because even when they show it letterboxed on TV, you're still missing edges. And it's a miracle that this stuff. When I first went to work with MGM UA Home Video in '88 for the 50th anniversary, and I helped put together the supplement on the tape and wrote a booklet that was attached to the box cover. It was the beginning of a wonderful association with George Feltenstein, Ned Price, Alan Fish, all of those people. Excuse me. And the whole idea of these people, they were all, I guess the point I'm trying to make is that every single one of the people I've mentioned, and so many of the others, were tried and true Judy Garland fans. And they were going to make this the best they could as far as the budget would let them. And they have progressively worked with Oz, some of them constantly, some of them sporadically, but it's because they care that we get the benefits that we do. I like to think that in whatever way I get to talk about the film or write about the film, it also shows care, because I would not want to see this represented anyway but honestly and truthfully, and with the kind of joy it deserves. One of the great things about the research that I have been privileged to do across the decades is that pretty much every good thing you ever heard about these people is absolutely true. But as I was saying, uh, the people who worked on Oz or Judy, none of them were perfect, but they were far more real and human and humane than all the legends and the myths. I mean, it is appalling to me. I don't lose sleep over it, but you just kind of shake your head at, oh, you go on the internet, it's like 40 facts you didn't know about the Wizard of Oz, 20 of which are completely false, 15 of which are only part of the story, and the other 5 of which are, did you know Over the Rainbow was cut from the film at first? And it's like, but again, what Judy was forced to endure, and the treatment of this one, and the agony of that one, and it's like, we are unfortunately living in an era, and we have been for some time, where the great compulsion of some people is to throw mud over the stuff that makes other people happy. And again, though, no matter how much they try to do that with Oz, by the grace of God, they haven't done it yet.
Yeah.
Not
Well,
that you asked for a sermonette.
no, well, actually, that's actually kind of perfect, a perfect way to sort of wrap up our conversation. I'll just say, I'll just ask you one last thing. What do you hope that audiences continue to take away from The Wizard of Oz for generations to come?
I think there are so many things that to this day and in the future can be taken away from Wizard of Oz. The idea of friendship, the idea of devotion to people bonding together. It doesn't matter how diverse they are. You can't be much more diverse than a girl from Kansas, 160 or 120 little people, a scarecrow, a tin man. I mean, that's diversity. But how they all help each other, they all look out for each other, that this is how you go through life, and that you make the most and the best of it, that you cry when you have to, but you laugh as much as you can. On a purely, and this isn't generational, because I was so into MGM sound and Nelson Riddle sound and Mort Lindsay sound, orchestrations and singers. When the Beatles broke when I was 13 years old and rock was reigning supreme, I was not in the least bit interested in it. Not that there isn't some worthy stuff then and ever since, but I hope that people realize, especially kids, that there is another kind of music, that they don't have to just like what is trendy and modern and very often raucous or profane or negative.
Mhm.
Oz and Meet Me in St. Louis and An American in Paris and Singing in the Rain and The Bandwagon,
Mhm.
Gigi, Fair Lady, Music Man, all of those, that kind of song
Mm.
is important.
Yeah.
And Wizard of Oz actually now is the introduction to that kind of music
Mhm.
for children. Um, so again, there's so much that you can walk, admiration for what was accomplished, joy in what Frank Baum created. I mean, because if he didn't have that imagination, we wouldn't have any of this.
Mhm.
And the fact that Metro invested the time and the money. I always say Frank Baum, MGM, and Judy Garland. Those are the 3 things that coalesced,
Yeah.
because as much as I'm going to sound like a fan, I don't think there was anybody then, nor has there been anybody since, who could have brought to that role everything that she did and pull you in, no matter what your age or gender, into that story. And you go along the journey with her, which you do when you read Baum's books, and those are good journeys to take.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to sit down today with us, and thank you so much.
Oh, wait, I do not have to manufacture the enthusiasm for this. And God bless my parents, they're gone now. But when I bring the books home, the Oz books I'd written or the Judy books I'd written, their basic attitude was, well, Johnny Fricke, we'll look at them, but you've been telling those stories in the living room since you were 5 years old. We don't need to read every word. And they were kidding. But again, this is something that I love to do. So anytime at all. Thank you.
Thank you very much.